Good morning. Welcome to Cornerstone Church. Definitely am missing getting to worship and praise with you here in person, but I am glad for technology and the ability to be able to record and at least I know that we joined together this morning and we worshiped our God together. So today is Palm Sunday, a little different Palm Sunday than we are used to as far as, again, not being together. But we can celebrate the fact that Jesus made his entrance into Jerusalem today, on this day many years ago, knowing more than anyone the work that he was going to do that week for us. So if you would pray with me and thank our God for the sacrifice that he made on our behalf, I appreciate it. Lord, today we come to you. God, I know many are concerned with what's going on around the globe, as they should be. But God, allow us to, God, have some freedom and some peace in knowing that no matter what happens, you're in control. God, you've known the end since the beginning because you are the beginning and the end. God, allow us to rejoice this morning in knowing what the meaning of Holy Week is for us. God, allow us to rejoice in knowing that your death was not final. And God, what's coming is freedom that you brought to us all. God, it's in your name we pray. Amen. God sent his son. They called him Jesus. He he'll lay for you. He lives and died to buy my pardon. Head empty graves there too. My Savior lives because he lives. I can face tomorrow because he lives. All fear is gone because I know he holds the future. His life is worth living just because he lives. way to victory. I see the light of glory and know peace. Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future. In life is worth living just because He lives. Because I know He holds the future. In life is worth living just because He lives. Again, thank y'all for joining us this morning. I hope the music was encouraging to you. I hope you got to praise this morning. I'm going to turn it over to Mark. He's going to continue in 2 Corinthians today.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Clay. I'm sitting just outside the camera, jamming away. We are blessed to have a guy like Clay be a part of what we do here. So, Clay's correct. It is Palm Sunday. That's a man-made day to remind us and to help us have some symbolism for what's about to happen or what did happen 2,000 years ago. And the beauty of what happened 2,000 years ago is that it continues to live today. So it wasn't just a Chronos event, it's a Kairos event that echoes and lives and continues to influence all of us. It's interesting to me that Jesus on Palm Sunday did not come into Jerusalem and do a political takeover. He didn't come into Jerusalem and do a military takeover. Some, at least we believe from the text, that some of his followers, the apostles, felt like he was going to take over Jerusalem. We know that Peter had a little bit of that attitude. I'm pretty sure that Judas as well, the two key players in this last week's story, had that attitude that this guy's going to come in and we're going to take over. We're finally going to get our place. Peter might be the vice president or the associate mayor or the city manager or something of Jerusalem, and Judas would certainly be the CFO or the COO or whatever role he wanted to play as valued, trusted lieutenant. And I think for Judas in particular, that whole incident of washing the disciples' feet threw him off. Judas was a guy who was opportunistic. Certainly we see that, but he also had a heart. He went out and killed himself. So we know there was remorse in Judas. But prior to that, I think, and I'm just imagining, hopefully in the context of our biblical text, that Judas had this wave of reality wash over him that Middle Eastern kings do not wash their buddies' feet. And I think he realized at that point that this man's not here for a takeover, that what he's been saying about the greatest amongst you must be the servant, the first should be last, those who humble themselves will be exalted, and the exalted will be brought down, and so on and so forth. I think it occurred to him as he watched Jesus wash the feet of his disciples and his feet as well, that this man had no intention or would never be able to win a political coup. And I think it's then that things began working, at least the final ticks of the clock began working in Judas. And Jesus knew that, of course. Someone who humbles himself and serves us that usually exposes true agendas. So this is Palm Sunday, as Clay rightly points out, and next week is Easter. Watch for Wednesday, where myself or maybe Clay and I will be announcing something we're going to do next week, and we want to invite you to be a part of it. If you're hearing some of the stuff going around town, hang on till Wednesday, and we'll fill you in on that. On Wednesday, I'll be back here again at 6:30, reviewing the message that we talked about. We're in 2 Corinthians chapter or verse 1, and I want to remind all of us that context is everything. So we have to remember the context of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and it comes, obviously, 2 Corinthians comes after 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians was forceful and hard-hitting and confrontational. 1 Corinthians really dealt with a number and variety of issues that Paul wanted to straighten out amongst these people who were trying to form a little church in the absence of Scripture, in the absence of Jesus himself, and in the absence of Paul himself. They were trying to figure out, what's it mean to be a follower of Christ, or in those days, the way. What's it mean for us to step out and away from our Judaism and step out in a way into something different that we really don't know much about? We're getting it through the stories that we hear, and now obviously from Paul. And as they were sorting those things out, Paul writes a hard-hitting letter that you and I call 1 Corinthians. And once again, not to drive this home, but I just find it fascinating. 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians. Paul had written a previous letter, and now 2 Corinthians then becomes 3 Corinthians. But I'm starting to get bored with that story, even myself. You all know it by now. Welcome to everyone who's tuning in from around the country. We're so glad you're here. I'm going to set my notes right here and read some of the text for us. Verse 1, chapter 2. So I made up my mind that I would not make another visit to you. Who is left to make me glad, but whom I have grieved? I wrote as I did, so that when I came, I should not be distressed by those who ought to make me rejoice. I had confidence in all of you that you would all share my joy, for I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart, and with many tears, not to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you. So the idea that Paul's first letter and his first visit were strong and tough and confrontational, he wants us to know here that he did that out of love, like a good father that might discipline his son. Painful for the son, but it's instructive for the son. And if it's done not with good parenting, with a man or a woman who's in control of themselves and mature, it's not a whipping, it's not a beating, it's not a licking, it's none of those things that is only punishment, but it's actually teaching discipline. It's discipline that looks forward. Folks, punishment always looks back. Discipline always looks ahead. Punishment tears down, takes a price, extracts some blood. Discipline, always looking forward, builds up, encourages. Punishment breaks relationship and usually leaves the burden of repairing the relationship on the one who got punished. Discipline is always enforcing and enhancing and reconnecting the relationship, and the burden for reconnecting the relationship is always on the one who does the discipline. You asked me about my text, and my text is simply this: God was the offended one, and God took the initiative to come to us, not to punish, but to discipline us, if you will, to rescue us, if you will, to save us, if you will, even if it's from ourselves. Jesus didn't come to punish us. Quite the opposite. He came to save us. So that's what we have, the idea of a good father saying hard things to their son or their daughter, and having done it out of love. For some of you, for many of us, that's a foreign idea. I didn't learn that till many years later. I was brought up with punishment for what I did, not discipline for what I had done, and instructive training for what I had done. So we have this here. Paul says it was really hard for me to write. Folks, I made a phone call this morning just before I walked in here. It was a phone call to somebody I loved. And they were not particularly in a mood to hear what I had to say. But I stuck with them. I listened to them. I listened to what their thoughts were. And they continue to think that they're right and that their position is absolutely correct. But I assured them that there's a relationship that's broken and they could help fix it. I'm not sure this good friend could hear that yet. But I took the initiative to make that phone call, not to expose them, not to humble them, not to threaten, not to confront, just to love and to be a friend and to invite them to a better place, to a higher place. And I think that's what Paul's doing here in his text, and that's what he's explaining to the people that he has done. I hope you get that. I hope that helps with some parenting. Hope it helps with your friendship. I told this person that whoever is the most mature in the room, even if they're the offended one, because the offended ones so often go off and pout, they stonewall, they give the silent treatment, they punish, somehow they punish. They let you know what you did that was wrong. But in Jesus' case, he was the offended one, and he took the initiative to make it right. If we're the offended one and we just sit in our offense and swim in our own anger, that's a narcissistic perspective that Jesus did not do. Jesus stepped out of his offense and pursued us. And that's what Paul does here. And hopefully, the person I called this morning felt a little bit of that strong, gracious pursuit on their behalf, because that's what it was. And we'll see what effect it has down the road. I don't think I'm right. I don't think I'm wrong. But I trusted my heart and knocked on the door. And I hope some good things happen as a result of that. Maybe some of us need to make a phone call today, because we just love sometimes swimming in the offense. We just love being the offended one sometimes because it gives us something to talk about. It gives us something to be mad about. But in this case, Paul writes another letter. And this letter is what we have in 2 Corinthians. And he said, I told you what I told you. I told it to you out of love. I'm reaffirming that I told it to you out of love. And now I want to get to a specific situation. And let me read this. This is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful section. Starts with verse 5, if you're still with me. If anyone has caused grief, he has not so much grieved me as he has grieved all of you. To some extent, not to put it too severely. The punishment that's inflicted on him by the majority is sufficient for him. Now, instead, you ought to forgive him, comfort him, so that he will not be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. I urge you, therefore, to reaffirm your love for him. In other words, do to him what I'm doing to you now. I was rough with you out of love. And now in this letter, I'm reaffirming to you that I love you and that was done out of love. And you know you can trust me. And so now I'm calling you all to go to the man that was offensive and comfort him. Reaffirm him of your love. Forgive him. No, but I want him to pay a pound of flesh. No, but he hasn't paid enough. No, he hasn't shown remorse in the way I think he should show remorse. He doesn't show sorrow. He actually gets up and goes to the grocery store every day. He drives his car like nothing ever happened. He actually smiles when he sees me. And Paul says, forgive that man. Comfort that man. The punishment has been enough. Let it go. He goes on to say, the reason I wrote you was to see if you could stand the test and be obedient in everything. If you forgive anyone, I also forgive him. And what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake, in order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. So many of our offenses, folks, I say this gently, are not ours to take. Somebody did something to someone else. A first person offended a third person, or maybe a third group, and we, as a second person, witnessed it, and we take offense. But the offense wasn't to us. We take up offenses for other people. And we do that so often because, again, it breaks us out of our boredom. It helps us feel righteous, helps us feel right. It works within our own narrative of, I'm a good person and I would never do that. I have this thing together, I would never do that. And judging others is the way we prove it. I don't mean to be hard on you folks. I am the first person who sits in this section. I am guilty of judging so often. I've got this little grace Jesus that sits on my shoulder, but on the other shoulder is this judger that just says, look at that guy, look at what he does. And as soon as I say that, I become what I'm accusing that person of becoming. I call that person offensive, but I'm busy judging which is offensive. I'm busy drawing lines in the sand of who's in and who's out, who's good, who's bad, who's like me, who's not like me. I am really guilty. But folks, I want to tell you an illustration or two. We have trouble in the church often living with messy people. If we all turned the window around and looked in the mirror and saw ourselves, we would realize, if we were honest, that we're all messy. And the ones of us who don't think we're very messy are actually the messiest of us all. Some people's messy is really out front. They were caught in something. We all know who they are. Other people's messiness is more internal. The arrogance to think that I'm not that messy. The judgment that we do quietly, that Jesus calls out in the Gospels. The righteousness. The lack of presenting a front that's humble, but inside we're anything but humble. The gossip, the fake smiles, the phony smiles, the things we do so that others will see us, the language we choose so that in this circle we're nice and we're accepted, and in this circle we're nice and we're accepted, but the language is different. Folks, we're all of us, in this boat of needing forgiveness. We're all messy. I heard one time a pastor say that we need to get sin out of the camp. I had lunch with that pastor later, and I said, I want to suggest to you that I don't think we can ever get sin out of the camp. He had a reference to the Old Testament Israelites in the desert. We can't get sin out of the camp, and that's the point. It will never be out of the camp. Folks, as soon as you or I come into the camp, sin has entered the camp. If you're friends with me and I'm in your camp is not clean. And the same goes with all of us. And that's why we need Jesus, who came and took care of our messy lives. He hung out with Peter, he hung out with Judas, he hung out with Thomas, the rest. And they were messy, and he knew it. He hung out with them. Folks, I like people who hang out with me, even though I'm not real tidy. They're gracious people. At a particularly hard point in my life, I formed this statement, and you can write this down, and you can hopefully use it in your own head. I want to give the sort of grace that I want to get. And at that point in my life, I needed and desired, I was lusty for grace from anywhere. Grace was all I wanted. And then it occurred to me, maybe this is a taste of what I should be giving to others. And I made some phone calls in my messy state. And I said, I've been hard on you. I've judged you. And I want to give you grace. If I have any grace to give, which I really don't, I want to give it to you. Would you forgive me? I'm sorry. Because now that I'm in such a need of grace, such a felt need of grace, I'm really tasting what you probably wanted then. And that phrase has stuck with me. If you don't feel like you need grace today, look in that mirror a little harder. Ask your spouse, do I need grace today? Has there been a moment this week when you've needed to silently forgive me? If you want to ask a stronger question, but we're afraid to do so because of my response. I promise you, I'll listen to you now, and I'll give whatever grace I can. I won't be defensive. If you'll give me whatever grace you can and tell me about it. Ah, that's the church. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we are all messy all the time, and that's why we need Jesus constantly, all the time. But it's hard for us in a church to deal with messy people. Did you hear what she did? Did you hear what I heard about her? Oh my goodness, don't sit by them. Oh my goodness, don't be seen with that person. They've got a reputation. Or whatever it is that we do to play it safe so that we can pretend that we're not messy. Oh, we've got a lot of work to do here. I do, still a lot. And Clay's off to my 1 o'clock right here, just outside the camera. But I know Clay's got a lot of work to do here, as nice of a guy as he is. And Clay, we meet on Tuesday mornings, and I like doing that work with you. I want to tell you one more story after I mention this idea of the scapegoat. In Leviticus chapter 15 or 16, the doctrine of the scapegoat is introduced. And that doctrine is where Israel would put all of the sins that they had done and over this period of time, and the priest would pray over the head of that scapegoat and put all the sins of all the people on top of the scapegoat. And then they would do some other rituals, symbolic things. Then they would open the city gates and send the scapegoat out into the desert with no water, very little food. And the idea is that eventually the scapegoat would die, and with him, all of our sins. When we catch someone in a sin, our tendency is to reinstitute the doctrine of the scapegoat. They need to be punished. And we put all of our stuff that we're not willing to admit onto this scapegoat, this person. And we kick them out of the city walls into the desert. And we call it church discipline. And I wonder what happens to those people. In my case, after weeks and months of wandering in the desert, thirsty and hungry, feeling the weight of so much, I found a community out there. I found other scapegoats. And we got together. And these other scapegoats were filled with grace for themselves and for me and for the people back in the city that had put them outside the walls. Are you with me on this? So Paul says to this person here, they have struggled enough. They don't need you to scapegoat them. They don't need your judgment anymore. They need for you to forgive them and actually take another step with action. Go comfort them. Invite them back into the relationship. If indeed you are truly the most mature, as you seem to be, it's implied. If you're truly the most spiritual, it's implied. Then take this step like I did, Jesus speaking first person, and reconnect, forgive, and comfort. I sat with a group of elders many years ago. They had just caught one of their own in a sexual sin. And there were some laws that had been broken in those days because of what this fellow had done. And they were having a tribunal, if you will, and they called me in as a consultant to mediate between the 3 or 4 husband and wife teams and all of their notes and all of their Bible scriptures all lined out, all of their facts and the truth and some of the elders. And this fella amazingly sat alone in a chair in front. And when I walked in, it felt like a tribunal. So I listened for a half hour or 45 minutes, and then they said, Mark, what do you think? And what they were expecting and actually wanting is, what does he need to do to be punished? What does he need to do to be restored? And so I started softly, and I said, I know that you want these things. I want to suggest to you that what he needs is something maybe different than what you're expecting. I think it's more severe, it's more haunting, it's more exposing. And of course, I don't have this word for word. This is my memory. I'm reenacting the situation. I suggested to them that they stone him. And I had picked up a few rocks in the parking lot just spontaneously on my way in. They weren't very big, but I scattered them around the table and I looked at each couple. And it was particularly the women that were scorning. Their eyes could have burned holes in their husbands and in this fella, and frankly now in me. I dropped a rock in front of them, and I asked them if they'd like to throw a rock. I'll get out of the way. Then I moved to the next person. I said, if you want to throw a rock, you want to take a rock? He nodded his head. Or you could do something I suggested even stronger, and that's lead. I know you want to bring this person in front of the church. I know you want to do church discipline, and some churches are very popular for that. And parenthetically, it does so much damage. It's the doctrine of the scapegoat, regardless of how you spin a particular passage in Scripture. Said, or you could do something different. You're the elders, you're the leaders, you folks are pillars of this church. I encourage you to lead, to do something. And we need to get this guy in front of church to confess. Do you agree? They said yes. So I said to them, then I want you to lead in that. And they said, yes. When shall we do it? And I said, I suggest this Sunday. They agreed. Sooner is better. It's some action. Yes, it is some action. It will show leadership. Yes, it is. I want this thing to take 8 or 9 weeks. I didn't have the laser eyes quite yet, but I did shortly. I said, I suggest you folks are leaders and that you should lead. And you're going to put this man in front of your church and expose him publicly with his wife and his children and with other people who aren't even involved. And you'll scapegoat him. So because you're going to do that anyway, let's make this as redemptive as possible. Let's make this a grace-based church if we can. He needs to go on the 8th week. Your senior pastor needs to go on the 1st week. And he needs to stand in front of the congregation and confess his sins. That would be leadership. That would be strong, humble, gracious leadership. And as each of you take a Sunday and confess your sins, expose yourself, ask for grace, humble yourselves, then this guy will go because you led. Does that move you, folks? It moves me. Paul here says, stop. The guy suffered enough. Reaffirm your love for him. The reason I wrote you was to see if you would stand the test and be obedient in everything, to see if you were strong enough. If you forgive someone, I also forgive. And what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I've forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake. For your sake. For my sake. In order that Satan might not outwit us. For we are familiar with his schemes. We know what he's up to. And he's dividing us. And he's dividing us now. He's moving us toward pride and judgment and punishment. He's not moving us toward discipline and grace and forgiveness and comforting. And he will divide us along who's right and who's wrong. And the side of right and wrong and judgment and punishment is always an easy place to land because it requires nothing of us. The side of grace and looking forward and reconnecting, reconciliation, humility requires everything of us, which is why we don't do it. We cite text, we highlight text, we circle text, we talk about how hurtful it is, we talk about how much damage that person did, when all the while our arrogant self is exponentially compounding that damage. I wish we could get this, folks. Can we begin to give the sort of grace that we long to get so that messy people could come to Cornerstone and feel loved, comforted? I was never invited back to that church for any more consultation. I don't think they paid their bill either that I sent them. Such as it is. I was at a hard place, as those of you who know me know. I want to thank these guys, and I wrote them down, and I'm going to miss a few, but they gave me grace in my messiness when I had nothing to offer them. Mole, Johnny V, Goobs, Jonesy, Mark E, Clint, Lee, Roy, and many, many others who stood with me, who offered me jobs, who wept with me across tables, who headbutted me out of love. They stood with me. They made all the difference because they gave grace. The ones who gave judgment, I couldn't be near. Couldn't be near. Just like you. Folks, can we give the sort of grace that we long to get? Can we look in the mirror and see our own messiness, which will allow us to accept and forgive other people's messiness? Mark, what will happen? Our church will run amok. Nah, quite the opposite. Love will prevail. Grace will prevail. And messy people just like you and just like me will learn to swim in the giant ocean of grace, and we'll invite others to swim with us. And that's the gospel. Jesus was the offended one. Jesus took the initiative. Jesus invaded our world and said some very hard things. And then Jesus silently went to Jerusalem next week. And then he died for us, the offenders. The offended one died for the offenders. And next week we have Easter. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the resurrection means in terms of grace and in terms of life. And I may stick with the 2 Corinthians text, I'm not sure, but we'll see what happens. So on behalf of Clay and I and all the leaders at Cornerstone, thank you so much for being here. For those of you who have tuned in from all over the nation, thank you so much. It seems like I invited you. I'm not sure that I did, but they tell me I invited you. So welcome aboard. I hope you're encouraged. For those of you who are at Cornerstone, or for those of you like Daniel in Chicago who decided to do something kind, your donations would be appreciated right now. You can go to Cornerstone Church and PayPal. We'll accept your donations. We still obviously have expenses. Don't worry about Clay and I right now. We've got other things we can take care of. But give if you can. I'll see you Wednesday. Clay and I will both. We'll see you back here next Sunday.